Glasgow seem to be washing their hair tonight, so thanks for making the effort and coming along to the Scottish Secular Society meeting. We meet on the first Thursday of every month, and the format of our meetings, which we're hoping to do going forward now, is we're going to have some really interesting and engaging speakers attending our meetings. And like I say, it's first Thursday of every month, but we may rotate it. So one Thursday will be a speaker meeting, and the second month Thursday will be a roundtable debate about all things secular and all the things that's happening in Scotland that we want to discuss and amongst ourselves as a group. But tonight, as part of our sort of inaugural event, we have two great speakers here. We're really privileged to have them both attending the event. We have Dr. Elliot Bulmer, who is the author of A Model Constitution for an Independent Scotland, basically. Is that right?
It's a model constitution for Scotland. And my second book, A Constitution for the Common Good, just come out.
Yep.
So get the sequel. It's even better than the
Is there a Kindle version?
Not yet, but there might be eventually.
Right.
Just literally come off the press a couple of weeks ago.
Right, excellent, excellent. And we have Nathan Alexander, who's made his way all the way from St Andrews to be here tonight. And I didn't know he was supposed to meet, actually. I would have given the guy a lift instead of allowing him to get trains, planes and automobiles to get here. And Nathan's bit, I believe, is going to give us a talk around the history of secularism, and the other part of it is
race.
And about race as well, from 18th century onwards, 19th century onwards. So I'll stop talking and I'll pass you over right now to Dr. Bulmer to pass it. So go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for coming. Well, what I find really exciting about this is I think this is where politics, in the broadest possible sense, should be discussed around a table with friends and new friends and with a pint in your hand. And I think this is a much more conducive way of discussing these things than more formal context. So I'm not going to make a speech tonight. I'm just going to sort of float a few thoughts and ideas and share them with you as to the connection, well, really the connection between secularism, the Constitution, and the independence referendum. And I should probably start by talking a little bit about why I find myself here. I am a board member of CIS. It's something that I think is a critical issue in the world today. And I'm here because my background is in constitutions. I've spent probably about the last 7 years thinking, working, writing about constitutional issues, mainly, not exclusively, but mainly in the Scottish context. And focusing on the question of, if there were to be an independent state, how do we make it work? How do we make it work for everyone? Because if there is going to be an independent state, it can't be a state just for the SNP or just for yes voters. It has to be a state for everyone. It has to be an inclusive state and a democratic state. Because ultimately that's what makes a country work. So I combine these interests in secularism and in constitutional design. And I really want just to talk today about the point at which they fuse and how they interact with the referendum debate. I see an independent Scotland as a great opportunity for those who are, let's just say, fed up with the extent of institutional religious privilege that exists under our current arrangements. I see it as an opportunity to create a new state on a different foundation, which will be able to treat its citizens as citizens first and foremost, and not as members of one or other particular religious community. And we don't have to dig very deeply beneath the surface to know why that's an important issue, particularly in this city, I mean in other parts of Scotland as well. But there are divisions in our society which are perpetuated by aspects of a sort of ascriptive, i.e. you're born into it, religious identity. And there are decisions that are made that are shaped by those identities and don't treat people as equal citizens. They overlook that sort of citizen dimension. So I see it as a great opportunity, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. First of all, what do we mean by secularism? Well, I'm sure in this gathering, we're all people who are interested in secularism, and we all bring our own ideas as to what that means precisely. But I think the Scottish Secular Society has been really good on identifying secularism as something that is inclusive. Secularism is not the exclusion of religious voices. It is not the persecution of religious people. It is not the imposition of mandatory atheism by the state. It is the creation of a state that belongs to its citizens and that treats its citizens as citizens and allows them freedom of religion and freedom from religion and does not discriminate between people on the basis of their religion. In other words, secularism and democracy, secularism and the res publica, exist in a very similar kind of conceptual space. That our approach to secularism is not defined by necessarily an antipathy against religious people. It's defined by a desire to create an inclusive democratic state that treats its citizens as equals. Okay, so that's the definition. And now I'll talk a little bit about the nature of the choice between us, because these will tie together. When we vote on the 18th of September for the question of whether or not we want Scotland to be an independent country, we are not choosing a government. We are not choosing a set of policies. We are not choosing a party. We are choosing whether we wish to create a new state. That's the essence of it. It's a new state, a new constitutional order, a new foundation, not for who's going to be in government and who's going to be out, but for how we constitute our government, how decisions are going to be made, who is ultimately going to be the people choosing our government and holding our government to account. And when you look around the world, you see that the United Kingdom has given independence to, I think, over 50 countries since the Second World War. And this is a well-worn path. Some of those countries have done really very well. They have thrived, they have prospered, they have developed their societies, and other countries have really struggled. And if you look at what distinguishes those that have struggled from those that have succeeded, those that have really had the opportunity of independence and yet wasted it, and those who have had the opportunity of independence and maximised it, the difference is, have they managed to sustain a well-constituted democracy? Because when it comes down to it, the question is this: who is best to make decisions for the government of Scotland? Is it the people of Scotland, or is it somebody else? And that somebody else could be the Westminster government. Okay, but here's the rub, and here's a bit where I'm going to, annoy perhaps the nationalists in the room. That somebody else could also be a Scottish government. And I would say would be very little better off if we become independent and we end up with a sovereign Scottish Parliament that is unaccountable, that is corrupt, that is unresponsive to the people of Scotland. Because other countries have been down that route, and it ends in tyranny and oppression and wasting of resources and underdevelopment. Nobody wants that. That's not in anybody's interests. But fortunately, that's also not what's going to happen. And the reason that that's what's not going to happen is because the Scottish Government have had the foresight, although they don't talk about it perhaps as much as I would like them to, they've had the foresight in the White Paper to make the Constitution front and centre of their prospectus for a Scottish state. That is to say, a Scottish state will be bound by a set of written, clear, fundamental laws that are our constitution, that belong to us all, and that establish, regulate and constrain the institutions of government in such a way that whoever you vote for and whoever gets into power will not be able to abuse that power and will not be able simply to govern in their own interests, because they will be held accountable through the Constitution and through the institutions that that Constitution creates to the people. In other words, that Constitution becomes our title deed. That says you, the people, or rather we the people own the state, not you the government. It says to the government that you don't own the state, we the people own the state. The government is at best our tenant. We're the landlord. The government is our employee, and we're the employer. And that's fundamentally radical, because that doesn't exist in the British state, and it's not going to exist in the British state. In the British state, power descends from on high, and it comes through some magical, I don't understand it, there's some magical sort of mysterious thread through God to the Queen, who then sort of graciously decides to share some of it with her ministers and her parliament, not our parliament, her parliament. The whole structure of the British state is essentially a medieval monarchy. And you could argue that it's the last medieval monarchy, unless you want to look at, it's the last major medieval monarchy of Europe. And we have that unbroken tradition in the UK that goes back to medieval times. Now, there were a lot of good things in the Middle Ages, don't get me wrong, and I think there's something we could learn sometimes from the city republics of the Middle Ages. But the fact remains that this is a fundamentally hierarchical society and a fundamentally hierarchical, undemocratic state, where we, the people, are at best allowed a walk-on occasional part. We don't own this state. We don't control it fundamentally. It's also irreformable. If you look at the manifestos of the parties entering the 2010 general election, every party promised some sort of constitutional reform. I remember when the Conservative Liberal coalition was formed in the May of 2010, Nick Clegg wrote an article that was on the front page of the papers about how this was going to be the greatest moment of constitutional radicalism since the Great Reform Act. And I thought, well, that's very strange, because if you look at the Great Reform Act, the thing about it is that it wasn't very radical. The elite conceded just enough to keep themselves in power, to keep the structures that have really go back all the way to the Norman Conquest in place. Meanwhile, the Belgians were having a lovely revolution and writing a splendidly democratic constitution for its time. So, in its sense, even by their comparisons, they set their bar low. And having set this bar low, they then failed to reach it. Because if you look at the reform programme that they put forward, well, the House of Lords hasn't reformed. The House of Commons electoral system is still utterly indefensible. The whole relationship between the Crown, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet and Parliament still rests on unwritten conventions, where essentially the Constitution exists inside the heads of Gus O'Donnell, the former Cabinet Secretary, and Vernon Bogdanor, the great academic. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but there's this idea that the Constitution is a private thing. It's something that they, the elite, those who rule, those who control the country, and always have, and always will, they make it up as they go along. And it's flexible, but it's flexible in their interests. It offers us no guarantee. And so they've not managed to actually perform this. So this is the situation we're in. We're in a state with hierarchical power, which is irreformable. And that state, as you would fully expect, doesn't do a particularly good job at actually delivering for people, because the people don't control it. It's run by elites, it's run for elites. Now, I could give you a long list, and I cite many examples in my book, of policy decisions that make sense once you realise that the country, i.e. the UK, is not run for you and me, and for people that we know, and for people that we love. The country is run for a relatively small number of people. And some of them are people who own Scotland, and some of them are people who own the home counties, and some of them are people who own London. But in a sense, oligarchy does as oligarchy is. The bad policy decisions from our point of view, the fact that there is such a wide gap between what people want out of their state and what the state delivers, comes from the nature of the state itself. What we have an opportunity to do on the 18th of September is to change the nature and the basis of the state. And to launch a process that will lead to constitution building and to the reconstitution of a Scottish state founded on democratic principles. And I'm excited by that. And I think everybody should be excited by that, because we have the opportunity, as we the people, and I don't care what your national identity is. I have no idea what my national identity is. You know, it's not an issue for me. I'm a Northern European, probably. But, you know, who cares about that? What I do care about is the opportunity that we have as citizens to reconstitute our state so that it serves us better. And that will be the outcome that is set out in the white paper and that is promised in the event of a yes vote. How does this relate to secularism? I'll bring it back to that. As it stands, the Scottish Government is proposing a two-stage process of constitution building. This is quite sensible, because you can't necessarily do everything at once. Building a constitution, if you're going to make it embrace all the people, takes time. We have to go out and listen to people, we have to engage people. There has to be a process that's structured to do that. And many countries have done this, by the way. You know, this is a proven technology, if you like, of developing a constitution. But nevertheless, it takes time. And we can't do that before the referendum, because half of society won't engage in that process. And so we'd be talking in an echo chamber. And that doesn't work. You've got to bring everybody on board. So there needs to be this interim constitution so that we have some framework in place from day one. And within that interim constitution, there needs to be a process for future constitution building. Now, as it stands, that interim constitution says very little about religion, the nature of the religious identity of the Scottish state, church-state relations, education, all the issues that the Scottish secular society has engaged in. It says very little about those things. The only thing that it says is that it essentially incorporates Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is your freedom of religion, thought and conscience. And that's a good baseline. So some people have said, well, what's the point? Because I've seen this interim constitution, I've heard about this, I've heard that the Scottish Government has no plans to change the existing legal status of the Church of Scotland, etc. So what's the point? What am I actually going to achieve from a secular point of view? And I would say this. What you achieve is the reversal of the foundation. Rather than a state that is founded essentially on a quasi-divine monarchy, you have a state that is founded on democracy. Once you have that foundation in place, you can then build on it. And that leads into the constitution building process. You cannot secularize the UK. You cannot expect the United Kingdom to reconstitute itself as a modern, inclusive, democratic state, because to do so would pull that bottom foundation stone away and it would all crumble down. And there's just no appetite for that. That would be a kind of constitutional moment for which there's just no appetite south of the border. When you have the democratic foundation in place, yes, you can have a monarchy if you want. But it's a monarchy that exists as a cherry on top of a thoroughly democratic cake. It's decorative. It's not foundational. In the UK, the divine monarchy is foundational. In Scotland, it would be decorative, and we could change it, and we could change it because it's in the Constitution. And it's in the Constitution, it means it's written down, it's clear, it's precise, and it's subject to the sovereign people. So, I think the answer is that this interim constitution is probably not going to change things radically. But what it does offer is this constitution building process in which the arguments that secularists might want to make and other democratic reformers might want to make can be heard. And that's where we have the real opportunity to make a difference. Now, what will come out of that, we don't know. Ultimately, if the constitution is going to reflect the people, then there has to be an element of compromise, an element of give and take, a deliberate desire to be inclusive. And, you know, we might not all get our wish list. And that's true. We might not all get our wish list on day one. We might not get it 20 years' time. But I'll tell you one thing. If we vote no, we won't get any of it ever. And that's the difference. Because there's no appetite UK-wide for things like the disestablishment of the Church of England or changing the accession oath. Because you're just pulling away at these sort of Kaplunk style, pulling away at these sort of pillars of the establishment. In Scotland, if people want to put these things in a constitution, they're going to have to justify it. They're going to have to explain in a public forum why there should be clerics on school boards. Why the constitution should recognise the legal position of the Church of Scotland. And I think just that very process of forcing these things to be examined, it cracks the lid off, it opens up the can of worms. And we don't know what's going to come out of that. But what I do see is an opportunity to make a difference. If we care about those kind of issues, to make a difference through that process of building an independent state with a new democratic constitutional foundation. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions at this moment?
Yeah, definitely. Wonderful. Viva la revolution. Right. This is the atmosphere, isn't it? I want to be drinking absinthe and right. A question. Yes. Theocracy. I mean, I remember, Elliot, you're such a credit to have on the Scottish Secular Society board. You've been there for a very long time, longer than our dear chair. But theocracy, I remember you I think not ticking me off, but you undermined me on the point that I described the UK as a theocracy, and you said, no, it's not a theocracy, it's an oligarchy.
Yes.
But I disagree with you there. I think you're right, it is an oligarchy, but I also think it's a theocracy. Do you still disagree with me?
We're essentially getting to a definitional point. I think I've just been reading Abraham Kuyper, who is a great Calvinist political theologian. You know, everyone needs a hobby. And you know, he's making the case for this kind of this idea that authority should come from God. But he says even that's not theocracy, because in his definition, theocracy is only when God is directly ruling the state. And he says the only real theocracy was ancient Israel. Now, that, you know, so it's a definition. Is the UK a theocracy? I would say no. We are not governed primarily by religious codes, religious laws, or by, you know, a divine institution. I think what we are is a state that uses clericalism to legitimate itself and to prop up essentially oligarchical powers. And so I would say, you know, you have this monarchic foundation with the sort of divine legitimation around that, on which this oligarchy rests. But it's the oligarchy that really rules us. Our laws are not, for the most part, determined by religious considerations. Rather, they're determined by economic considerations. But it's very handy if you can sort of co-opt religion and use it to help you in that task.
And they do. I mean, 26 unelected clerics in the
Absolutely.
highest legislature of the land.
Yeah.
Very ornate seats at the very front.
Yeah.
And the most insulting thing to Scotland, of course, is that these are Church of England, my religion, you know, not yours, mine. And they're at the very front of the House of Lords, all 26 of them. And the Church of Scotland are not there because the Church of Scotland, of course, doesn't have bishops, they have ministers, it's Presbyterian. And the Roman Catholics, of course, well, they're not even entitled to access the throne, let alone anything else, we don't want that kind of rubbish. And Islam, let's not even go there. And the Welsh Church and the Northern Ireland Church, they're not even established. So they're not even allowed access to this elite front bench. And it's extraordinary how much power they have, particularly with LGBTI rights, of course, because they will stymie and delay and stop any equality legislation at every opportunity. And that doesn't matter for most people, but it matters to me, and it matters to a lot of people, and it matters to people like secularists who do think about these kind of things. And completely on your side, Elliot. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah, the Church of England is a fascinating organisation. It had an opportunity with the Occupy protests, and Occupy St Paul's, and people camped out. Now, the Church of England had an opportunity for once in its history to side with the people and not the establishment. And I think he was the canon, or I think he was the canon or the dean or something of St Paul's, a guy called Giles Fraser, tried to support this protest and say, yeah, this is what an honest, genuine Christianity is about. People are campaigning against social injustice. Well, there was someone who was pretty famous in the origin story of Christianity who did just that. So let's support these people. He was kicked out of his job. And I think that showed, that this is not more than just an institution of the state. It is essentially a state department for religious affairs. And this is why I think, as secularists, we have this opportunity to connect with people who are genuinely and sincerely motivated by a personal faith that calls them into action in the public realm on issues such as justice and poverty, and who might be equally critical of the power, the influence and the corruption of the institutional church.
Well, thank you for not being put off by the nature of a lot of atheists on Secular Scotland that come on the Facebook page. You are so full on, and I think that's a wonderful accepting part of Christians and ex-Muslims, Muslims, people that are at various stages of that faith that are accepting about that, because it's a difficult one to balance on Secular Scotland. Part of me loves the mocking memes against religion. I love it. But at the same time, I want people like you on board too. It's a difficult one.
Yeah.
It's a real difficult one.
Does anyone else have a question for Elliot?
Can I just ask, you were saying about constitution, the discussion of constitution. How do we guard against it becoming practice like the American Constitution, which was its foundation meant to be of the people for the people, and is now totally corrupted?
Okay, that's a really good question. Sometimes when you're making the case of Constitution, people will say, well, look at the American Constitution. They've got a Constitution, it doesn't work very well for them. And it's an understandable point, because we exist without a written Constitution, but there's a country that has a very strong constitutional culture that we're culturally familiar with because we get it in the movies, etc. And we're familiar with the American Constitution. The Swedish Constitution, or the Norwegian Constitution, or the Irish Constitution might not enter our heads so often. So we have this natural comparison to the United States. Unfortunately, it's kind of the Model T Ford of constitutions. The American Constitution is over 200 years old, and we've learnt a lot in constitutional design since then. And if you look at the history of constitutional design, it comes in waves, it comes in phases, it comes in fashions to a large extent. And if you were constituting a state today, you wouldn't look to the American model as an example. You'd probably look to other Northern European countries with more recent constitutions. The question though is, how do you stop it sort of stagnating? And I think the big problem they did with the American Constitution is they made it too rigid. To amend the US Constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, followed by a 3/4 majority of the state legislatures. And that's a really high hurdle, particularly in a country where the Constitution has taken on this kind of quasi-sacred status. Most other constitutions, yeah, there is a hurdle to change them. You want the Constitution to be relatively stable. You don't want to change it with every government that comes and goes. You want to make sure that you have checks and balances in place. But like, yeah, Sweden is a good example. So in Sweden, you can change the constitution by 2 decisions of Parliament with a general election in between. And if 1/3 of the members of Parliament demand a referendum, then there has to be a referendum on it. That's a reasonable method. Gives you a bit of, but it doesn't create such a high barrier to change that when there's a problem you can't fix it. And so that's first thing, keep it flexible. Secondly, no constitution is ever designed to last forever. I think you've got to look at constitutions as being, the time frame is decades and generations, but not necessarily centuries. So we can have a constitution that might last 120 years, and then we do it again. And that, you can't obviously predict that because the future is unknown. But I think we need to see a constitution as something that is foundational and is enduring, but is not in the strict sense of the word necessarily permanent. It always has to be open to change. The other thing that you can do, and I love the Latvian constitution. Latvia gets a bad rap in lots of ways because it's a small country and it's had its difficulties, and it's had a relatively difficult transition to independence and to statehood, etc. But one of the great things about its constitution is that the people can initiate amendments. So you get 10% of the electorate can gather signatures and put forward a proposed amendment to the constitution that then has to be voted upon. And those kind of mechanisms, they have to be carefully designed, they have to have proper checks and balances in place, etc. But those kind of mechanisms can protect the state from that kind of elite capture and enable people to continually engage with this process of redefining their fundamental laws in ways that continue to be relevant for their lives and changing circumstances.
Elliot, quick question for myself. Do you think Scotland gains its independence? Would there be any logic in a second chamber?
That's a good one. Any logic in a second chamber? I think what we need is something that performs the functions of a second chamber. So if you look at the things that a second chamber traditionally does, in a federal state it represents different regional interests. Scotland is unlikely to be a federation. It is quite a regionally diverse country. And so there might need to be some way of making sure that we take into account regional and local interests and don't just centralise power in Edinburgh. They also perform functions of scrutiny, of review, of broadening discussion, of representing broader interests. And you can do that through a second chamber. I'm not necessarily convinced that a second chamber is the only way to perform those functions. So for example, I'll use the Swedish example again. Actually no, I won't. I'll use Denmark. Denmark's a much better example. So in Denmark they only have one chamber. But 1/3 of the members of Parliament can demand a referendum on legislation. So you're using the minority as a kind of internal check. Now, what generally happens is nobody wants to risk a referendum on some stupid point of, an amendment to a bill. So what it does is the fact that the opposition have that power forces them to compromise and to come together. In Luxembourg, there are big kind of consultative chambers with social partners and trade unions and professional associations. And legislation goes through a process of scrutiny and evaluation by these chambers before it's voted on, finally, by the unicameral parliament. The Swedish example is, if it's a bill that affects fundamental rights, then I think it's something like 10 members can suspend it. I need to check that, unless a 5/6 majority overturns it. So you could, when you're doing institutional design, you can say, well, what do we need a second chamber for? What are the functions it needs to perform? And then you can build those in around a single chamber, if that's what you want. I see those as the kind of questions that a constitution-making body would have to grapple with. I sit on the fence on this issue. I can see advantages both ways. I think the difficulty is there are a lot of second chambers in European democracies that really struggle to define their role and purpose. The Irish Senate would be a good example. It doesn't have much power. It has a fairly tenuous representative basis. How effective is it compared to the kind of institutions that you see in...
Was there not recently a referendum to attempt to abolish it?
There was.
There was.
Yeah, there was a referendum, and it failed. But it mainly failed because the government was proposing it, and the government was unpopular.
Yeah.
Which probably tells us more about voting behaviour in referendums than it does about anything else. And if you look at those countries that I cited, like Denmark and Sweden, they had second chambers and abolished them. And when they abolished them, that's when they put these other checks and balances in place. And it might just be a slightly leaner, cleaner system. Just have one chamber, but make sure that chamber has proper set checks and balances. The one thing that a single chamber struggles to cope with is this idea of different regional representation. So that would be the challenge, is how do you balance the fact that most of the population lives in the central belt, and yet people in the Highlands and Islands need adequate representation. And that's difficult to do in a single chamber.
Excellent, excellent. Anyone else?
Nope.
No? All right. I'd just like to thank you again, Elliot.
Oh, thank you.
Just have a 10-minute break for more beers or a natural, and then we'll move on to the second part of the evening.
Thank you for coming along tonight to what is the best meeting we've had for a considerable period of time, and listening to Dr. Bulmer. For our second talk tonight, we're going to listen to Nathan, who is a postgraduate student in history at the University of St Andrews. Nathan researches an aspect of 19th century secular thought. The mid-19th century was secularism's golden age, in which it became a large and radically motivated political movement. The most famous figure among many of this time was, of course, Charles Bradlaugh, the founder of the National Secular Society. This was, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the history of 19th century secularism, an era best summed up in the words of the historian Edward Royal. The secularists were a small group of men and women from the working and lower middle classes, whose mission was the radical restructuring of society by peaceful means. Their fundamental belief was that the evils of contemporary society were attributable to the baneful effects of religion, and their aim was to discredit Christianity and those social institutions which depended upon it. They were Republicans in a country increasingly devoted to its queen, and atheists in a society which outwardly at least was profoundly Christian. Their hero was Thomas Paine. So, Nathan's work examines an aspect of the thought of this movement. He explores how atheists, agnostics and freethinkers viewed the idea of race. This was, of course, an age in which racist ideologies and colonial imperialism was, for many, the order of the day. He addresses a gap in our histories, For while the influence of Christian thought has been explored on contemporary issues such as the nature and origins of humanity and the legitimacy or not of slavery, historians have yet to consider what non-religious people thought about race. Alexander's ongoing research suggests that while some embraced the racial thinking associated with the age, there was also a strong anti-racist strain of thought among atheists. Within his tradition, atheists argued variously against biological determinism, slavery, imperialism, and racial classifications. His work connects two fields, the history of atheism and the history of the idea of race, which have previously had few points of contact.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for that nice introduction. Yes, like you said, I research atheists and so on, and their ideas about race. So tonight I'm going to be talking about particularly secularists like Charles Bradlaugh. And actually, Bradlaugh and fellow secularists were quite interested in racial thought, and historians haven't really noticed this yet. So I think this is sort of maybe a darker chapter of secularist thought. So my first example I'm going to talk about is a pamphlet that Charles Bradlaugh wrote in 1865 called "Were Adam and Eve Our First Parents?" And this was important for Bradlaugh. So Bradlaugh said, Adam is particularly important, he says, "The account of the creation and fall of man is the foundation stone of the Christian church. If this stone be rotten, the superstructure cannot be stable." So Bradlaugh saw it as important to refute the idea that Adam was the father of all mankind. And to understand why he did this, we need to know about these two competing ideas to explain the origins of humanity. So the first one is monogenesis. So mono for one and genesis for origin. So this is the Orthodox Christian view. Monogenesis said all humans descended from one origin, which was Adam and Eve, about 6,000 years ago. However, a competing view was started to come to prominence in the 19th century and before, which was polygenesis, which is multiple origins. People looked at the world and saw different races, and they thought, how is it possible that such different people could come from one mother and father about 6,000 years ago? Yes. So this had important racial implications. Since everyone didn't have the same parent, they were permanently separate. And in fact, many advocates of polygenesis ranked various races hierarchically, inevitably with the Europeans at the top. But the theory of polygenesis also had theological implications. And this goes back to the idea of original sin. So original sin was when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, and they kind of ate the forbidden fruit, and this was where the sinful nature of man kind of came about, and it was transmitted to the rest of humanity by Adam and Eve. So that makes sense in the monogenesis account, but in polygenesis, there's problems with this. As Bradlaugh says, if not everyone is related to Adam and sharing in his original sin, so if Adam didn't transmit his original sin to everyone, then, to quote Bradlaugh, what becomes of the doctrine that Jesus came to redeem mankind from a sin committed by one who is not the common father of all humanity? So in this case, then, if the polygenesis is true, Jesus' salvation applied to only a certain portion of humanity. So this view was heretical, obviously, and yeah, so monogenesis remained the orthodox account. So Bradlaugh kind of seized upon this polygenesis account of humanity. And to do this, he relied on Josiah Nott. Now, Nott was an American physician and a slaveholder and a racial scientist. Nott, in 1854, wrote a book called The Types of Mankind. And in this book, he argued for the superiority of white people and the dangers of, or the harmful effects of race mixing. So for example, a quote from his work, "It requires no prophet's eye to see that Caucasians are destined eventually to conquer and hold every foot of the globe, where climate doesn't interpose an impenetrable barrier." So Nott saw Caucasian people as sort of a superior race, and Nott advocated polygenesis. And Bradlaugh picked up on his arguments because they could refute the idea of Adam as a common parent for all of humanity. So some of the arguments that Bradlaugh used in this pamphlet from 1865 were to show that various races were diverse from about 6,000 years ago when Adam was supposed to have lived. So one of the ways he did this was to look at ancient Egyptian monuments from about 5,000 years ago. Now these depicted, supposedly depicted white people and black people and so on, and they looked about the same as they did 5,000 years ago as they did today, or back in the 19th century. So this seemed to show that the races were permanently diverse, and they weren't gradually changing. Another argument that Bradlaugh borrowed from Nott was that there was no mechanism for a gradual change there was no way for various races to diversify. So, for example, Bradlaugh quotes Nott to say, "A sunburnt cheek is never handed down to succeeding generations." So for example, if you get a sunburn, it's not passed down to your children. Europeans who went to Africa or the Americas didn't seem to be getting any darker. So in this way, there was no way for one race to change into another. So Bradlaugh kind of uses this argument to point out what he saw as the permanent diversity of races as a way to refute the existence of Adam. Now, Josiah Nott's book, Types of Mankind, wasn't just taken up by Bradlaugh. It was also reviewed in George Holyoake's periodical The Reasoner. And Holyoake was maybe like the second most important secularist in the 19th century. And Holyoake gave Types of Mankind a favorable review. He said that it contains passages of great interest to the free-thought reader. The work is written with a manly, scientific independence of Scripture. So Holyoake and Bradlaugh saw this polygenesis as a way to chip away at Christianity. But polygenesis wasn't the only interest the secularists had in race. And Bradlaugh was a member of the Anthropological Society of London, which advocated a kind of polygenesis. The founder of the organization, James Hunt, advocated polygenesis, and in 1863 gave a particularly racist lecture called "On the Negro's Place in Nature." In this lecture, he said, for example, "There is as good reason for classifying the Negro as a distinct species from the European as there is the zebra from the ass." And, Hunt continued, "If in classification we take intelligence into consideration, there is far greater difference between the Negro and the European than between the gorilla and the chimpanzee." So this is someone who Bradlaugh thought was considered a friend, and he's advocating like quite racist things. And this obviously had an effect on Bradlaugh. So in an 1881 debate with a Christian reverend named James McCann, the discussion turned to the issue of free will, whether humans have have free will or not, which is kind of a classic atheist-Christian sort of debate. So Bradlaugh said that humans don't have free will, but he says, and I quote, "There are marked degrees of differing ability, and that which is possible for the Negro on given conditions, and that which is possible for me on like conditions, are possibilities which are not the same, are possibilities which differ largely from each other." So here you have Bradlaugh using kind of a racist argument, even though it wasn't really called for. So why were these racist arguments so appealing to secularists? So one thing is that they were heretical. So the racial scientists, so James Hunt, the Anthropological Society founder, and Josiah Nott, the American slaveholder, were both kind of proudly heretical. They loved to agitate the clergy, and they kind of portrayed themselves as modern day sort of Galileo. They thought they were championing science against religious bigotry. So this was appealing to the secularists. Another appeal is that the secularists liked the idea of considering mankind as just another animal. In the Christian view, I guess there's something special about mankind. They like the idea of saying, there's nothing special about humans. So to do this, they needed to posit some kind of bridge between animals and humans. And they've actually kind of looked to the supposed lower races as sort of a bridge between apes and humans, or Europeans. So one example of this is Edward Aveling, who was a vice president of the National Secular Society. And he was a scientist, and he also
a fairly terrible human being.
Yes. So he he was actually romantically involved with one of Karl Marx's daughters, Eleanor.
Of course, they did kill herself.
Yeah. So he was he cheated on her, and that led her to commit suicide. So he's, like, by all accounts, a terrible person. And so in 1884, he wrote an article that appeared in Bradlaugh's newspaper, The National Reformer, called Brute Men. And in this article, he talks about what he considered as, brute men, which is humans who wouldn't be classified as humans if you were strictly talking about their mental capacity, I guess. So these brute men included indigenous people in Africa, in Australasia, and the Americas. So he kind of posited that they were sort of a bridge between apes and Europeans. So an example would be language. So to quote Aveling, he said, "It may be fairly contended that the interval between the grunting speech of the Bushman or the clicking dialect of the Kaffir below and the refined and musical language of a great European orator or singer above is as great as that between the language of the South African brute men and the language of the anthropoid apes." So Aveling saw sort of a clear gradation, I guess, between the languages that you would get from Europeans to the lower races, supposedly, and to apes. But paradoxically, despite this racism, secularists led the charge against, or not necessarily led the charge, but were strong, presented a strong opposition to imperialism in the 19th century. So in South Africa, in China, in India, in New Zealand, anywhere where the British were expanding and kind of imposing their will on the native populations, the secularists spoke out against it. I think it was partly because of perhaps a sympathy with these lower people, these supposed lower races. They perhaps identified with them because the secularists were also victimized by what they saw as sort of an arrogant, Christian, heavy-handed British state. And the imperial conflicts were made worse because Christian missionaries would actually by going into these societies would actually sometimes be the cause of conflict and would ultimately lead the military to be getting involved. So that was another kind of annoyance for the secularists. I think this anti-imperialism is seen best with Charles Bradlaugh. And so Bradlaugh was actually an MP from 1880 to 1891. During this time, he took up the unofficial title of Member for India. So India at the time was a British colony. So that the Member for India was the person who, or was the Member of Parliament who took the most interest in Indian affairs. So Bradlaugh consistently advocated for more rights for the Indian people. And Bradlaugh actually traveled to India in 1890, a year before his death. And he was greeted as a hero there. And so much that in 1891, when he died, so his funeral was attended by all the Indians who were living in London at the time. And this actually included, interestingly enough, Mohandas Gandhi, the future Indian independence leader, although he was still just studying law at the time, so he wasn't really important at this stage, but it's sort of interesting anyway. And it's also interesting that towards the end of the 19th century, secularists start to lead the charge against this idea of race. One example is J.M. Robertson, who actually took over editing Charles Bradlaugh's newspaper after Bradlaugh's death. So Robertson wrote a book in 1897 called The Saxon and the Celts. And in this book he argued against the idea of using race as a way to understand European history. So at the time lots of people looked to Ireland and they saw the Irish as sort of innately inferior. This was the reason for problems in Ireland. So Robertson really criticized this approach and said we can't look to biology, we need to look at social factors. So I think it's perhaps a bit redeeming for secularists that Robertson kind of was an early opponent of racial thinking. So anyway, just to kind of wrap up, there's some debate about whether we can actually learn anything from history. And I think in this case, perhaps there's some lesson that, and it's the need for humility. The racial thinkers of the 19th century never considered the possibility that they might be wrong. They were completely certain that historians in the future would look at them like Galileo and like Isaac Newton, like really scientific visionaries. But now, of course, we see that they were completely wrong, and they were actually like quite terrible people. So with this in mind, I think we should constantly be thinking about, what if we're wrong, and constantly be reevaluating our views and being self-critical. There's no guarantee that historians of the future won't look back at us and say, what were they thinking about a certain issue? But I think if we're critical of ourselves and constantly try and reevaluate our own arguments, I think we at least have some hope of avoiding the criticism of future historians. Thanks.
Any questions? Gary's bound to have a question.
Oh, that's interesting that you've done your own work. I'm interested in the you did mention the Malthusian. It's that whole sort of thing. I think it's important to remember that this was another age, and if you look in, say, the Daily Record, if you look at the Daily Record at the beginning of the 19th century, you'll see plenty of really shocking references, anti-Semitic references to Jews and things. I remember one that I read at the turn of the century when I was doing some other research, and I can't remember it now, but it was about somebody going to an island off Germany, and it was mocking. This is in the general newspaper. It was mocking the Jews, and how ridiculous they looked, just everything. It was absolutely shocking. And you have to remember that at that time, that was common language.
It was.
And it wasn't, you know, yeah, they were wrong. A lot of people were wrong. That's human nature, I think. We learn from the past. I hope we do. Holyoake was probably more of an important person, I think, than Charles Bradlaugh. I mean, he was quite an important person in the secular movement, but I think Holyoake was probably more important. He was really the founder. But there were lots of other interesting things sort of happening, but it was, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting subject, but I think it has to be taken into its context.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. The context also includes kind of popular reading from the late 19th century and early 20th century, which, from what I've seen of it, was unbelievably racist and ghastly. And some of the lesser works of John Buchan are among the least racist of this genre. And they're just a product of the kind of society. This was when the British Empire was gloriously spreading itself across the world and colouring bits of countries that no one had previously heard of or hadn't existed until then, red, and justifying this to this imperial rhetoric. Are there any further questions?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that